Henry Whitmore prided himself on his generosity, the kind of generosity that came with plaques, newspaper photos, and applause at gala dinners. He believed himself a man who understood people. Yet, the moment the mechanic's son sat across from him, he decided without question that the boy had never held a chess piece in his life. "Don't worry, son," Henry said, his voice carrying the kind of paternal warmth that also sounded like condescension. "We'll start with the basics. Pawns move one space at a time unless it's their first move." The boy didn't flinch. He didn't even smile. He simply reached out, turned a pawn between his fingers like it was a coin he'd flipped 1,000 times, and said quietly, "Sure. Let's start there." Henry didn't know that the boy's name was Elijah Carter, or that Elijah's bedroom walls were covered with faded posters of chess grandmasters and championship medals that glinted like quiet defiance in the dim light of his family's apartment. Henry didn't know that Elijah had spent years carving strategies into his brain like a second language. All Henry saw was a pair of worn jeans, calloused hands, and skin that in Henry's mind came with a narrative already written. The cafe was warm, scented with roasted coffee beans and cinnamon. But outside its large glass windows, the city was winter cold, the wind carrying dust and the faint scent of car exhaust. Inside, people glanced at the table now and then, some curious, others with the faint smirk of those watching a rich man do his good deed for the day. Henry began explaining the night's movement, his tone patient but patronizing. Elijah nodded at all the right moments, saying nothing. His mind, however, was already mapping the board, calculating a dozen variations before Henry had even moved his first piece. By move 6, Henry was still talking. By move 8, he realized Elijah had quietly set a trap, a subtle positioning that a casual player would never notice until it was too late. Henry chuckled, masking the faint unease creeping into his stomach. "You've got a good eye," he said, pushing his rook forward. "Beginner's luck, maybe?" Elijah finally smiled, though it was the kind of smile you couldn't read, equal parts amusement and something colder. The game tightened. Henry's confidence began to slip as Elijah's moves grew sharper, bolder, like a boxer who had been holding back until the right moment. Henry's pieces started to disappear, one by one. The cafe grew quieter. People leaned in. "You've played before," Henry said finally, his voice lower now, his grin forced. "A bit," Elijah replied. Henry didn't yet know that "a bit" meant 3 state championships and a top 10 national ranking. He didn't know that Elijah had faced players twice his age and walked away with trophies almost bigger than him. And he definitely didn't know that Elijah had been playing quietly in his head since the moment they sat down, the way some people breathe without thinking. As the endgame approached, Henry's king was cornered. He tried a desperate move, an old trick meant to buy time, but Elijah didn't even blink. He moved his queen into position with the quiet certainty of someone who didn't just play chess. He lived it. "Checkmate," Elijah said softly. Henry stared at the board. The air between them was suddenly heavier, charged with something unspoken. For the first time that evening, Henry didn't feel like the teacher. He felt exposed. The cafe murmured. Someone in the corner chuckled. Henry sat back, his cheeks warm, his polished self-image wobbling like a piece knocked loose from the board. But Elijah wasn't gloating. He simply began resetting the pieces, his hands steady, his expression unreadable. "You want to go again?" Elijah asked. Henry hesitated. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the sidewalks white. Inside, the warmth felt different now, sharper somehow. The boy across from him wasn't just a good deed. He was a storm in disguise. Henry nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, his voice softer. "Let's play again." Henry Whitmore had never been beaten so cleanly, so decisively, in public. He could take losing in private golf, poker, the occasional auction bid gone sideways, but here, in front of a silent cafe full of strangers, it felt different. Elijah sat quietly, his long fingers moving the pieces back to their starting squares. His movements were efficient, practiced, unhurried. Henry noticed something odd. Elijah didn't just place the pieces. He set them down like he was setting a story in motion, as if each pawn, rook, and bishop already knew its fate. "White or black?" Elijah asked, his eyes steady. Henry cleared his throat. "I'll take black this time." "All right," Elijah said, almost kindly. The second game began with Henry playing more aggressively, pushing pawns forward like a man trying to prove something. Elijah absorbed the pressure like a sponge. Every time Henry tried to force an opening, Elijah closed it with surgical precision. The kid's face gave nothing away, but his play was a language all its own, a cold, lyrical rhythm. Henry's mind drifted. He remembered the fundraiser 2 nights ago, where a colleague had suggested he do something visible for the local community center. The idea had come wrapped in subtle expectations. Take a photo with some underprivileged kids, write a check, shake hands. And so, when Henry saw Elijah sitting alone in the corner of the cafe earlier that evening, hunched over a notebook, he'd assumed the boy was another candidate for his charity narrative. He hadn't imagined this being stripped bare on the chessboard by the very person he thought needed teaching. "You're not from around here, are you?" Henry asked between moves. Elijah tilted his head. "Born here. South Side." Henry nodded slowly. "Tough neighborhood." Elijah's rook slid across the board like a blade. "Tough enough." The game went on. Henry lost again, though this time he managed to stretch it out longer. The cafe had grown quieter still, the sound of the espresso machine now distant, as though the whole room was leaning toward the small square battlefield between them. "Best 2 out of 3? Elijah asked. Henry almost said no. His pride was already bruised, and some part of him wanted to retreat, to salvage what little dignity remained. But another part, the part that had gotten him through decades of business deals, hated walking away from a challenge. "Deal," Henry said. The third game began. By move 5, Henry realized he was playing differently now. Not better, necessarily, but with more attention. He stopped narrating the moves. He stopped assuming. He started watching. Elijah's eyes flicked over the board in micro-movements, his jaw tightening slightly whenever Henry made a move worth respecting. Halfway through the game, Henry noticed something else. Elijah wasn't smiling, but there was a light in his eyes, the kind of focused joy you only see in someone doing the thing they were born to do. Henry pushed a pawn forward, testing a gap in Elijah's defenses. Elijah countered without hesitation. Henry leaned back, studying the boy. "You play like someone who's been coached," Henry said. Elijah's lips curved into the smallest grin. "I've had a few teachers." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Elijah's gaze didn't leave the board. "Mostly books. A few people online. My dad taught me the basics." Henry frowned. "Your dad plays?" Elijah shook his head. "Not really. He's a mechanic. Works late most nights. But when I was little, he brought home this old chess set from a yard sale. Said it might keep me out of trouble." Henry thought about that. He imagined a man with grease on his hands setting a dusty board in front of a boy, hoping the pieces could shield him from the streets. The third game ended with Elijah's victory again, though this time it was close enough that Henry felt a flicker of satisfaction. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "You ever think about competing?" Henry asked. Elijah looked at him, then really looked. "I do compete." Henry blinked. "Local tournaments?" "National," Elijah said. "Placed top 10 last year." The words landed like a stone in Henry's chest. He realized then how ridiculous he must have looked, explaining pawn moves to a boy who could dismantle him blindfolded. The heat in his cheeks wasn't embarrassment anymore. It was something heavier: shame. Shame that he'd assumed. Shame that it had taken 3 games to even ask the right questions. The cafe door opened, letting in a burst of cold air. A man stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, his hands still streaked with dark smudges from the garage. His eyes found Elijah instantly. "Hey, Eli," the man said, walking over. "You ready to go?" "Yeah, Dad," Elijah said, starting to rise. Henry stood too, extending a hand. "You must be Mr. Carter." The man shook it, his grip firm. "That's right. And you are?" "Henry Whitmore," Henry said, his practiced smile faltering just slightly. "We were just playing a few games." Mr. Carter glanced at the board, then at his son. "He beat you." Henry chuckled, though it came out thin. 3 times. A slow grin spread across Mr. Carter's face. "Yeah, that sounds about right." They gathered their things. As Elijah zipped his jacket, Henry found himself blurting out, "You know, I sponsor a few young players for international travel. If you ever—" Elijah shook his head. "Thanks, but I'm good." There was no malice in his voice, just a quiet certainty. They left together, father and son stepping out into the cold. Henry stood there for a moment, watching them disappear into the swirl of snow and city lights. He felt an unfamiliar ache in his chest, not the sting of defeat, but the sharp clarity of a man who'd just realized how small his view of the world had been. The cafe noise returned. The barista called an order. Life moved on. Henry sat back down, staring at the empty board. For the first time in years, he wondered if maybe it wasn't other people who needed teaching. Maybe it was him. 2 nights later, Henry Whitmore sat at his kitchen table, staring at a chessboard he hadn't touched in years. The pieces gleamed under the warm light, but they looked different now, less like carved wood and more like fragments of a language he didn't fully understand. He replayed the games in his mind, Elijah's subtle traps, the economy of his moves, the confidence. But most of all, Henry kept replaying the boy's refusal. "Thanks, but I'm good." It had rattled him. Not because Elijah had rejected his offer. Henry was used to people saying no to his money. It was the way Elijah had said it, without arrogance, without gratitude, without even hesitation. It was the sound of someone who didn't need saving. For a man like Henry, who had built his reputation on being the savior, that was new territory. He poured himself a drink and opened his laptop. A quick search of Elijah Carter chess brought up pages of results, tournament photos, match footage, interviews. There he was at 16, holding a trophy with both hands, his expression a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. There he was again, in a community gym, playing 3 opponents simultaneously. Henry clicked a video. Elijah sat across from a seasoned adult player, a man twice his age, wearing a suit and the smug grin of someone sure he would win. 10 minutes in, that grin had vanished. By the end, Elijah was leaning back, arms crossed, the board a graveyard of the other man's pieces. Henry closed the laptop slowly. He thought about calling Elijah, but the boy had given no number, no email, just his first name and the knowledge that he lived on the south side. Henry considered asking around, but the thought felt wrong, invasive somehow. And yet, he couldn't let it go. A week later, Henry attended a charity gala at the downtown hotel. He wore the usual black tuxedo, white shirt, polished shoes, but his mind was elsewhere. During the silent auction, he drifted toward the bar, where he overheard 2 businessmen talking. "You going to that city invitational this weekend?" one asked. "Maybe," the other said. "That kid Carter's supposed to be there. The one from the south side. Apparently, he's the real deal." Henry's ears pricked up. "When's that?" he asked, stepping into their conversation. "Saturday morning. Civic Center Ballroom." Henry smiled politely, thanked them, and drifted away. Saturday morning, the Civic Center was buzzing. Rows of long tables stretched across the room, each with a board, clock, and score sheets. Spectators clustered at the edges, whispering. Henry scanned the room until he saw him. Elijah sat at a table near the center, wearing a clean button-down shirt and dark jeans. His father stood behind him, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes scanning the room like a man used to measuring the world's intentions. Henry approached slowly. "Morning," he said. Elijah looked up, mildly surprised. "Mr. Whitmore, you mind if I watch?" Elijah shrugged. "It's a free country." Henry smiled faintly and took a place off to the side. The match began. Elijah's opponent was a young man from a wealthy suburb. Henry recognized his family name from donor lists. The kid had a confident air, the kind that comes from being told you're special your whole life. From the opening moves, Henry saw the difference. Elijah played with precision, each move part of a quiet storm building on the board. His opponent countered well at first, but by the 12th move, Henry could see Elijah tightening the noose. At move 22, it was over. Checkmate. The suburban player scowled, muttered something under his breath, and stood abruptly. Henry caught the word lucky before the kid walked off. Elijah didn't react. He simply reset the board for his next match. Over the next few rounds, Henry watched Elijah dismantle opponent after opponent, an older man with decades of experience, a college player with a scholarship, a prodigy from another state. The wins were clean, almost surgical, but it was in the semifinal that things turned. Elijah's opponent, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 20s, arrived late and with a scowl. From the first move, his play was aggressive not just in strategy, but in demeanor. He slammed pieces down, leaned across the board, muttered about street luck. Henry felt his jaw tighten. By the mid-game, it was clear Elijah was winning. The man's frustration grew. He began speaking louder. "Didn't think you people played chess?" he sneered after losing his queen. A hush rippled through the crowd. Henry's chest burned. He glanced at Elijah, expecting a reaction. But Elijah's face was calm, almost detached. 3 moves later, checkmate. Elijah stood, shook the man's hand briefly more out of formality than respect, and walked away from the table. His father followed. Henry stayed behind, watching the defeated man mutter to his friends. Something inside Henry snapped. He stepped forward. "You just got beat fair and square," Henry said, his voice low but steady. "If your ego can't handle it, maybe find another hobby." The man blinked, surprised, then scoffed. "And you are?" "Someone who's learning," Henry said, turning away before the man could reply. The final match was tense. Elijah faced a reigning state champion, a wiry, intense player with years of high-level competition. The game stretched for nearly 2 hours, the board swinging between advantage and danger. Henry stood the whole time, pulse steadying with each calculated move Elijah made. When the final checkmate came, the room erupted in applause. Elijah didn't smile. He simply exhaled, shook hands, and stepped away from the board. Mr. Carter clapped his son on the shoulder. "Let's get out of here." Henry moved toward them. "That was incredible," he said. Elijah nodded once. "Thanks." Henry hesitated, then said, "I think I've been looking at things wrong. If you'd let me, I'd like to support your next tournament. No strings, no speeches, just what you need." Elijah studied him for a long moment. His father's eyes narrowed slightly. Finally, Elijah said, "Well, think about it." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. As they walked away, Henry realized that for the first time in years, he didn't care about the answer as much as he cared about earning the right to be in the conversation. 3 weeks later, Henry Whitmore found himself in a ballroom twice the size of the Civic Center, chandeliers glittering, white linen draped across every table, and the scent of expensive perfume mingling with the faint tang of polished wood from the stage. The International Junior Masters Chess Tournament was the kind of event his social circle adored: prestigious, exclusive, and very, very public. It was also the kind of place where people like Elijah were rarely seen, and when they were treated like novelties. Henry spotted Elijah across the room. He was dressed simply, again, crisp white shirt, dark slacks, but his presence was different this time. He moved with a quiet assurance, scanning the room like a man who already knew he belonged there. His father stood nearby, expression guarded, eyes sweeping over the crowd in silent evaluation. Henry walked over. "Elijah," he said warmly. "Mr. Carter." Elijah nodded. "Mr. Whitmore." Henry hesitated. "I'm glad you came." Mr. Carter studied him. "We're here for the game." "Of course," Henry said quickly. "That's what matters." When the first round began, Henry took a seat in the reserved section, just behind the ropes. Elijah's first opponent was a European junior champion, the kind of player who smiled politely but oozed quiet condescension. By the 8th move, Elijah had stripped away the boy's center control. By move 15, the board was collapsing in on itself. When the final checkmate came, the European champion's handshake was stiff, his gaze carefully avoiding Elijah's. Henry leaned back in his chair, a slow smile tugging at his lips. Between rounds, Henry overheard the whispers. "Where'd they find this kid? He's good, but rough edges. Shame about the image sponsors love polish." It made Henry's stomach knot. He'd spent decades in rooms like this, ignoring comments like that, telling himself they were harmless. Tonight, they felt like poison. The semifinal was a war. Elijah faced a Japanese prodigy whose defensive play was as elegant as it was frustrating. The match stretched past 90 minutes. Each move a deliberate cut into the other's defenses. Henry could see the fatigue in Elijah's posture, the way his fingers lingered just a fraction longer over the pieces. But he could also see the spark, the same one from the cafe, flicker brighter with each exchange. When the Japanese prodigy finally tipped his king in concession, the room erupted in applause. Henry was on his feet without realizing it. And then came the final. Elijah's opponent was a tall, clean-cut American player named Preston Hale, son of a wealthy donor family, a favorite among the crowd. The Hale family had been friends of Henry's for years. Preston's father, Richard Hale, was already working the room, shaking hands, laughing in his deep, booming voice. Henry knew that voice. He also knew what came with it. When the match began, the air was electric. Cameras clicked. The commentary from the live stream whispered in the background. Preston opened with an aggressive gambit, pushing his pawns like a man trying to intimidate his opponent into early mistakes. Elijah didn't bite. He responded with calm, precise countermoves, refusing to give up tempo. By mid-game, Preston's frustration was visible, a tightness around his mouth, a twitch in his hand. He leaned forward. "Didn't think I'd be playing someone like you in the final," he said quietly. Elijah didn't look up. "Your move." Preston smirked. "Guess they're letting anyone in these days." Henry heard it. His chest tightened. He looked around the room. No one else seemed to flinch. Some hadn't heard it. Others had, and simply let it pass. Something in Henry broke. By the 20th move, Elijah had the advantage. Preston tried to recover, sacrificing pieces to open the board, but it only dug the hole deeper. On move 29, Elijah slid his rook into position, pinning Preston's king. "Checkmate," Elijah said, his voice calm, steady. The room went quiet for a half-second before applause broke out, polite at first, then louder as the result sank in. Henry didn't wait. He stepped forward, past the ropes, and clapped Elijah on the shoulder. Cameras flashed. "This," Henry said, loud enough for the front rows to hear, "is the best damn game I've seen in years. And if any of you still think skill has anything to do with where someone's from, take a good look at that board." There was a murmur. Richard Hale shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Henry turned to Elijah. "National champion, right?" Elijah's brow furrowed slightly. "Top 10, he corrected. "Not for long," Henry said. "Because next season, I'll make sure you have everything you need to go all the way. And not because I'm doing you a favor, but because you're one of the best players I've ever met." The applause grew louder. Some clapped out of genuine respect. Others clapped because the cameras were rolling. But in that moment, Henry didn't care. After the ceremony, Henry caught up with Elijah and his father in the lobby. "You didn't have to do that," Elijah said. "Yes, I did," Henry replied. "Because I used to think my role was teaching. Tonight, I learned it's listening and making sure the people worth hearing get heard." Elijah studied him for a moment, then gave the smallest nod. "Maybe we'll take you up on that offer." Mr. Carter extended his hand. "We'll talk." Henry shook it, the weight of the moment settling into his chest, not the hollow satisfaction of another good deed headline, but something heavier, richer. As they walked away, Henry realized he wasn't thinking about the cameras or the donors. He was thinking about the cafe, about the snow outside that night, about the quiet boy who had dismantled his game piece by piece and then, without knowing it, dismantled the walls he'd built in his own mind. Later, alone in his study, Henry set up a chessboard. He moved the white pawn forward 2 spaces, Elijah's first move from that night in the cafe, and stared at it for a long time. It wasn't the start of a charity project. It wasn't even the start of a mentorship. It was the start of a different kind of game entirely. And this time, Henry knew exactly which side he wanted to play on. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.